Hey everyone! Tonight we start with a culture that treated dying in combat as a resume highlight. The Vikings believed a glorious death wasn't just acceptable, it was aspirational. And yet, there was one group that caused even these famously fearless warriors to quietly rethink their enthusiasm. Before we begin, take a second to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what happens here. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, settle in, lower the lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background. Let's drift into this story together. Vikings were never supposed to show fear. Not in their stories, not in their records, and certainly not in front of anyone holding a weapon. Their society was built on the idea that hesitation was a flaw, while courage was a basic skill, right up there with rowing a ship or enduring surgery without anesthetic. From childhood, they were raised on tales of heroes who sailed willingly into hostile storms, fought enemies twice their size, and met death with a grin. According to Viking logic, dying bravely was excellent customer service to the gods. Fear was something monks felt while watching their monasteries burn. Vikings felt concern, briefly, before responding with violence. Their worldview was refreshingly blunt. If something frightened you, you attacked it. If that attack killed you, congratulations, you had just unlocked Valhalla and an eternity of bragging rights. Dying quietly in bed, on the other hand, was humiliating. No Viking wanted to be remembered as brave until the unfortunate incident involving a draft and a fever. This confidence bleeds through every source we have. Vikings mocked kings, insulted entire armies, and treated fortified cities as mild inconveniences. Even when they lost, they rarely admitted it outright. Defeats were blamed on trickery, bad luck, or someone else's poor execution. Fear was never listed as a reason. Which makes things interesting when the tone suddenly shifts. In a few rare places, the boasting stops. The sagas grow vague. Locations are mentioned briefly, then avoided entirely, like an uncomfortable family topic no one wants to revisit. There are no speeches, no heroic last stands, just silence. And in a Viking story, silence is deafening. These were people who crossed continents to raid, fought armored knights with axes and optimism, and believed fate was fixed. Worrying about consequences was pointless. You couldn't dodge destiny, so you might as well run at it. Fear had no practical value. And yet, there existed a land Vikings rarely raided, a people they didn't rush to challenge, whose reputation spread without exaggeration or bravado. There were no boasts, no heroic embellishments, just distance. The fear wasn't dramatic, it didn't shout or sing, it simply redirected ships. Because when a culture that treats death like a networking opportunity starts hesitating, something has gone profoundly wrong. Whatever unsettled the Vikings didn't do it with swords, it did it by making them uncomfortable. If the Vikings were afraid of fighting, they would have stayed home. They didn't. They built ships, sharpened axes, and sailed toward people who clearly didn't want visitors. Violence was familiar. Violence was the plan. Fighting made sense to Vikings. You could see your enemy, count them, and decide whether the effort was worth the trouble. Even when things went badly, at least the rules were recognizable. Someone swung, someone blocked, someone probably died loudly. What Vikings disliked was uncertainty. This fear had nothing to do with losing a fair fight. They weren't afraid of warriors, they were afraid of situations where their usual advantages stopped working, where strength, numbers, and confidence simply failed, where the world itself refused to cooperate. Battles were supposed to be loud, shields crashing, voices shouting, drums pounding. Silence was wrong. Silence suggested observation. Worse still were confrontations that never fully began. Imagine landing in unfamiliar territory, moving inland, and feeling watched without ever seeing anyone. No scouts, no villages, no obvious enemies, just forest, snow, footprints that vanished overnight, and arrows that arrived without warning and left before complaints could be lodged. This kind of conflict irritated Vikings deeply. They preferred enemies who stayed put long enough to be hit. They understood strength. This wasn't strength, this was rude. It felt less like war and more like being harassed by the landscape itself. Viking weapons were heavy, their armor was heavy, their shields were heavy. All of it worked beautifully in open terrain, but when movement slowed, visibility vanished, and sound behaved strangely, that gear stopped feeling impressive and started feeling exhausting. Suddenly, the fearless warrior was sweating, lost, and suspicious of every tree. This wasn't cowardice, it was frustration, paired with the realization that brute force was no longer solving the problem. Vikings didn't fear dying in battle, they feared wasting effort on fights that refused to happen. So when Vikings avoided certain regions, it wasn't weakness, it was refusal. Those lands would not fight properly, and that was unacceptable. Vikings were skilled travelers, but even they believed the world had edges, not physical cliffs where ships vanished into nothingness, though that would have been fitting, but psychological ones, places where maps blurred, directions became guesses, and confidence quietly slipped away. Beyond those edges lived the Sami. From a Viking point of view, they weren't simply distant, they were inconveniently positioned. Their territory stretched across forests thick enough to swallow sound, tundra that looked solid until it betrayed you, and snowfields where every direction appeared identical. Vikings loved coastlines and rivers. They liked places where ships could wait while crews caused trouble inland. Sami land offered none of that. The sagas mention these regions carefully and sparingly, like referencing a relative you hope never visits. Details are scarce, not from lack of curiosity, but because curiosity froze somewhere north of comfort. The Sami didn't live in towns that could be surrounded or burned. They didn't farm fields that could be stolen or build fortifications to admire before destroying. They moved constantly and quietly with the unsettling confidence of people who knew exactly where they were while everyone else didn't. To Vikings, this was infuriating. Raiding required targets, fixed ones preferably, stocked with supplies and panic. The Sami offered none of that. You could march all day and find nothing but trees, snow, and the growing suspicion that you were the problem. Even trade expeditions behaved differently here. Vikings traveled cautiously, often with guides. They didn't announce themselves, they didn't linger, and they absolutely didn't wander off alone, already a worrying sign for a people known for reckless confidence. The Sami seemed to operate outside normal rules. They thrived where Vikings struggled. They navigated without landmarks, appeared and vanished without explanation. It was as if the land recognized them and rejected everyone else. And that was truly what unsettled the Vikings. They weren't afraid of people beyond the map. They were afraid of people who made the map useless. Because when the map stops working, strength stops mattering. Vikings liked enemies they could blame, rival clans, stubborn kings, monks who looked at them wrong. What they didn't like was an enemy that couldn't be stabbed, shouted at, or defeated dramatically. Sami territory had that problem. The land itself resisted visitors. Forests swallowed sound, snow absorbed noise, orders turned into whispers that went nowhere. You could march with a group of heavily armed warriors and still feel completely alone, an unsettling feeling before any fight. Then there was the cold. Vikings respected cold, they lived with it. But this was different. This cold punished mistakes immediately. Step wrong and you sank. Move too fast and you sweat. Sweat froze. Your own clothing betrayed you. Armor became a liability. Heavy gear slowed movement. Shields struck trees. Spears caught branches. Axes lost their usefulness when there wasn't room to swing. The forest didn't care how brave you were. It cared whether you fit. Navigation became guesswork. Landmarks vanished, tracks disappeared overnight, and the sky flattened into a gray blur that made direction feel optional. Vikings mastered navigation at sea, but here, on land, it felt like nature was quietly laughing at them. Meanwhile, the Sami moved through this world effortlessly. They knew which snow would hold and which would swallow you. They understood wind, sound, animals, and terrain. To Vikings, it looked like magic. To the land, it was simply skill. And that imbalance mattered. A Viking raid relied on speed, momentum, shock, and fear. And here, none of that worked. The Sami did not build permanent settlements that could be surrounded and taken. They did not grow crops that could be seized or burned. Their wealth traveled with them: herds, seasonal knowledge, memory, movement. You couldn't destroy what refused to stay in one place. You couldn't steal what slipped into the trees before you finished issuing threats. And that made intimidation useless. Vikings understood fear as something you applied deliberately. You arrived without warning, you made noise, you demonstrated violence. People panicked. Panic led to obedience. That was how the system worked. The Sami did not panic. They simply left and returned later after the Vikings had moved on, colder, confused, and quietly wondering why they'd bothered in the first place. This complete lack of interest in conquest unsettled Viking leaders. An enemy who wants your land can be confronted. An enemy who wants nothing you possess is far harder to deal with. There's no leverage, no threat, no prize big enough to justify the effort. Sami communities were unimpressed by Viking ships, weapons, or reputation. They had endured generations of brutal winters, hunger, and isolation without outside help. A group of loud foreigners waving axes barely registered as a serious danger. At worst, they were a temporary inconvenience. To Vikings, this felt like disrespect, and disrespect was far more aggravating than open hostility. Worse still, the Sami grasped something Vikings struggled to accept. Land ownership is meaningless if the land itself refuses to cooperate. You cannot rule forests, snow, or migrating animals with borders and laws. The Sami lived alongside the land. The Vikings tried to impose themselves upon it, and that difference mattered. Nothing destabilizes a conquering culture faster than encountering people who simply do not care about being conquered. To be fair, Vikings were not unreasonable. They understood trade and loved it almost as much as violence. When it came to the Sami, trade wasn't just allowed, it was actively encouraged. Furs, hides, antlers, walrus ivory, and other northern resources flowed south through Sami networks. The Vikings wanted those goods badly. They were valuable, portable, and made everyone involved feel important and refined. So trade occurred quietly and politely, with far fewer weapons involved than usual. And here's the key difference. Trading expeditions behaved nothing like raids. When Vikings traveled to Sami territory to trade, they didn't swagger, they didn't boast, they didn't shout their ancestry into the wind. They brought guides, they followed customs, they offered gifts, they listened. This wasn't fear exactly, it was respect tightly wrapped in caution and sealed with self-preservation. Raiding, by contrast, was extremely rare, and when it did happen, it was almost always disappointing. There are no great sagas celebrating crushed Sami camps or legendary plunder. Instead, there are vague references to failed journeys, early returns, unexplained losses, and expeditions that came home with fewer men and less confidence, which, in Viking storytelling, is as close as you get to admitting failure. The Sami were not helpless traders waiting to be exploited. They controlled knowledge. They knew where resources lay, which valleys trapped travelers, which rivers vanished beneath ice. A Viking who traded followed Sami guidance. A Viking who raided ignored it. Only one of those approaches tended to end well. More unsettling still, Sami traders did not act like frightened victims. They negotiated calmly, they set terms, they refused bad deals, they walked away without concern. Vikings were used to forcing favorable outcomes through intimidation. Here, intimidation achieved nothing. You cannot threaten people who don't rely on fixed property. This created an unspoken understanding. Trade was acceptable. Violence was inefficient. And when a culture built on raiding decides something isn't worth raiding, that conclusion comes from experience. Vikings didn't fear the Sami as enemies, they feared them as people who made raiding unproductive, and inefficiency was terrifying to a Viking mind. Vikings preferred terrain that cooperated: coastlines, rivers, open land where you could see danger coming and respond accordingly. Forests were already suspicious. Northern forests were something else entirely. They didn't merely exist, they participated. Once Vikings moved inland in Sami territory, everything they depended on stopped behaving properly. Ships became useless ornaments sitting far away on the coast. Horses struggled. Supply lines thinned. Suddenly, the terrifying Norse warrior was just a man carrying too much metal in a place that deeply resented metal. Armor turned from a symbol of power into an exhausting burden. Steel snagged branches. Spears struck trees instead of enemies. Axes demanded space that didn't exist. Every step made noise, and every noise felt like an announcement. Vikings excelled at being intimidating. They were terrible at being quiet. The forest, however, specialized in silence. Snow swallowed sound completely. Shouting felt pointless. Commands dissolved into nothing. You could stand only a few steps from another man and still feel isolated. And isolation in unfamiliar land has a way of turning bravery into irritation, and irritation into fear. Meanwhile, the Sami moved through the forest as if it were a familiar hallway. They knew which paths stayed firm and which collapsed into traps. They understood animal movement, shifting wind, and how snow erased tracks. To Vikings, this didn't look like skill. It felt like favoritism, as though the forest itself had chosen a side. Campfires became liabilities. Smoke revealed positions. Light traveled farther than expected. Camps that felt secure one night felt dangerously exposed the next. Every morning brought new signs that someone had been nearby without announcing themselves. Disturbed trails, missing equipment, footprints that appeared and vanished like mockery. The forest never attacked directly. It didn't need to. It slowed movement, drained strength, eroded morale. Plans stopped feeling like plans and started feeling like hopeful suggestions. And the longer Vikings stayed, the worse it became. Eventually, even the most confident warrior begins to suspect that brute force is no longer the correct answer. And when a culture built on domination realizes the environment itself refuses to be dominated, the correct response isn't rage, it's withdrawal. The Vikings didn't lose battles in the forest, they lost momentum, and that was worse. They didn't need mass casualties to learn a lesson. They needed stories, and stories traveled faster than ships ever could. A raid that failed quietly was more dangerous than one that failed loudly. Men returned home without trophies, without songs, without explanations. Vikings narrated everything: victories, defeats, insults, even bad decisions. Silence was alarming. Warriors came back with fewer companions than they left with. They spoke vaguely of hostile land, strange weather, and journeys that didn't go well. Then they changed the subject. Nothing unsettles a room faster than a Viking who refuses to boast. Around fires and longhouse benches, cautious warnings spread. Don't go too far inland. Don't travel without guides. Don't camp there. Advice like that was rare in Viking culture. Normally, the advice was simpler: bring more axes. Then there were the missing men. No heroic deaths, no bodies returned, just absence. And absence is terrifying because it invites imagination. A man who dies in battle makes sense. A man who vanishes leaves room for every unpleasant possibility at once. Rumors filled the gaps. Some said the forest swallowed people.
Others claimed the Sami summoned storms or confused minds. Some whispered of spirits leading travelers in circles until they collapsed. The details varied, the conclusion didn't. Whatever lived there, whatever ruled that land, it wasn't worth testing. The stories weren't shouted. They were told quietly, carefully, with a seriousness that discouraged laughter. And when jokes stopped, fear had already done its work. Younger warriors listened, leaders altered routes, traders grew cautious. The maps changed, not with ink, but with habit.
Ships began sailing in different directions. Expeditions selected easier destinations. No announcement was made. Vikings didn't confess fear, they simply stopped showing up. This is how fear truly spreads in a warrior culture, not through panic, but through routine, through habits that quietly change, through routes that fade from memory, through places that become someone else's concern. The Sami never needed armies to protect their homeland. They didn't raise walls or banners. All they needed was reputation. And once a reputation settles into a culture built on warfare, it's almost impossible to erase. You can defeat an enemy, but defeating a story is far more difficult. There was no declaration, no council decision, no dramatic vow to avoid the North forever. That would have been humiliating. Vikings didn't formalize fear, they practiced it silently. Fear appeared as absence. Routes fell out of use. Hunting grounds became inconvenient. Journeys were delayed indefinitely, which in Viking terms meant never. Maps weren't erased, but they became vague. Blank spaces spread where details should have been. When people asked about those regions, the answers were brief, evasive, or ended mid-story. That silence mattered. Vikings were not subtle people. They celebrated triumphs loudly and mourned failures theatrically. When something frightened them, the lack of noise was the warning. Fear didn't shout, it whispered, and everyone paid attention. No one boasted about venturing deep into Sami territory. No one sought glory there. Young warriors were not encouraged to prove themselves in those lands. Instead, elders suggested safer targets, closer coasts, easier raids, predictable rewards, and elders were listened to. These were men who had survived long enough to earn authority. Even the sagas reflect this discomfort. The Sami appear briefly, oddly, and often without detail. They are mentioned at a distance, as if naming them too directly might invite trouble. Viking storytelling usually reveled in description, insult, and exaggeration. The restraint here is striking. This is not how you write about enemies you expect to defeat. Fear shaped behavior as well as language. When Vikings encountered Sami traders or guides, their tone changed. Less shouting, more listening, more courtesy. Not the respect of equals, but the respect born of uncertainty. You handle people carefully when you're unsure how much power they truly possess. And so, fear settled into routine. Ships chose other routes, expeditions turned back sooner, borders remained conveniently undefined. No explanation was required. The behavior explained itself. The North stayed quiet, not because it was empty, but because it was avoided. The Sami did not chase the Vikings away. They issued no threats, they conquered nothing. They simply stayed where they were, unchanged, while Viking attention drifted elsewhere. In a culture defined by action, that quiet withdrawal was the loudest admission imaginable. Fear does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it just revises your plans. The Sami never defeated the Vikings in the traditional sense. There was no decisive clash of shields, no heroic death in the snow, no epic verse carved into memory. That kind of ending would have been easier to accept. Instead, the Sami remained unreachable. They didn't outnumber the Vikings, they didn't wield superior weapons, they didn't overpower them with force. What they possessed was something Vikings found deeply unsettling: the ability to exist beyond control. They never stayed still long enough to be conquered. Camps moved, wealth traveled, lives followed seasons, animals, and knowledge only they fully understood. Vikings couldn't pin them down, surround them, or force them into the kind of battle Vikings knew how to win. And that was infuriating. Vikings preferred problems with clear solutions. Build more ships, bring more men, strike harder. But how do you strike an enemy who isn't there when you arrive? How do you intimidate people who disappear into terrain that actively resists you? The farther inland Vikings went, the more their advantages dissolved. Armor slowed them, noise betrayed them, ships became irrelevant, supply lines weakened. The Sami lost none of their advantages. They moved faster, carried less, and relied on knowledge rather than force. From a Viking perspective, this felt unfair, and unfairness is often mistaken for danger. The Sami didn't need to win battles. They only needed to need Viking presence costly, exhausting, and unrewarding. Over time, that approach worked perfectly. Viking leaders began asking practical questions. What do we gain? What do we lose? Is this worth it? Those questions rarely produced enthusiasm. The Sami were not an enemy to defeat, they were an environment to endure, and Vikings already struggled enough with the environment itself. So the Vikings did what any practical warrior culture does when faced with something it cannot dominate. They disengaged. They chose richer lands, softer coasts, easier victories, places where raids produced loot and stories, rather than frostbite and confusion. The Sami were not frightening because they killed Vikings. They were frightening because they could not be controlled. And for a culture built on domination, control mattered more than victory. For all the shouting, raiding, and enthusiastic axe swinging, Vikings were not foolish. Loud, yes, reckless often, but not foolish. They watched patterns closely, especially patterns involving men who did not return. Viking society prized courage, but it also respected experience, and experience quietly drew boundaries. Certain seas were avoided in winter, certain coasts were raided once and never again, certain rivers were approached with caution, and certain lands far to the north earned a reputation that dampened enthusiasm. This wasn't defeat, it was calculation. Viking leaders understood something simple. Not every place was worth the effort. Raiding worked best when rewards were clear and resistance behaved predictably. Monasteries, towns, and wealthy coasts were ideal. Sami territory offered none of that. No cities, no hordes, no terrified populations waiting to be exploited. Only cold forests and people who refused to cooperate. Over time, Viking attention shifted elsewhere, not because they were driven away, but because they chose not to return. Routes were adjusted, targets reconsidered, expeditions were planned with more realism and less optimism. This was Viking pragmatism at work. Bravery without reward was pointless. A warrior who died gloriously but gained nothing was still dead, and dead men do not raid again. Leaders who repeatedly sent men into hostile land without profit did not remain leaders for long. So the Vikings adapted. They acknowledged limits without ever admitting fear. The North became a place you treated with cautiously, traveled through carefully, and spoke about vaguely. No banners were planted, no victories declared, just a quiet understanding that some places resisted domination without needing to fight. That realization was deeply un-Viking, and that is precisely why it mattered. Vikings were not fearless because they lacked fear. They were fearless because they chose when fear was worth listening to, and in the case of the Sami, fear was delivering a very sensible message: stay away.
That would have fit neatly into the Viking mental filing cabinet labeled, "Things we will fix with more axes." Instead, the Sami terrified them by refusing to be controlled. They did not follow Viking rules. They did not fight Viking wars. They built no cities to conquer and planted no fields to seize. They lived lightly. They moved freely. They relied on knowledge rather than force, and in doing so, they quietly dismantled everything Vikings depended on to feel powerful. Vikings believed the world could be shaped through strength, fear, and reputation, and most of the time they were right. But the Sami world resisted shaping. Violence did not provoke predictable responses. Strength became exhaustion. Confidence turned into irritation. That was the real fear. Vikings did not fear death. They expected it. Fear came from uncertainty, places where effort did not guarantee results, where courage did not translate into control. The Sami embodied that uncertainty. They were not louder, richer, or more aggressive. They were simply impossible to dominate. And so Viking interest faded, not with rage or retreat, but with quiet avoidance. History celebrates conquerors, but it often forgets the power of endurance. The Sami did not need to defeat the Vikings. They only needed to outlast them. And they did. Their lands remained theirs. Their culture endured. Their way of life continued long after Viking raids turned elsewhere. Yes, the Vikings were feared across Europe, but they feared something too, a people who could not be conquered. They feared a land that would not submit. They feared the truth that not every problem could be solved by force. Sometimes the strongest victory is simply refusing to lose. When the sun dipped behind Edo's rooftops, the city didn't slow down. It sharpened its appetite. The orderly daytime world dissolved into something louder, wetter, and far more fragrant. Paper lanterns bloomed along the streets. Rain slicked the packed dirt roads. Smoke rose, not from homes, but from dozens of small charcoal fires carried and pushed by vendors who knew exactly when hunger struck hardest. These were Edo's night markets, not grand plazas, but narrow streets, bridges, temple gates, places where people naturally slowed. Vendors appeared as if summoned by hunger itself. Wooden carts rolled by, shoulder poles swayed, steam trailed behind them like ghosts. The city became a moving kitchen. Soy sauce, fish fat, and charcoal thickened the air. This was food without ceremony. You didn't sit, you stood beneath eaves, sleeves rolled, sandals soaked, eating quickly while rain tapped your hat. Perfect for laborers finishing shifts, messengers racing the dark, travelers arriving late, and samurai who pretended not to enjoy street food while absolutely doing so. Coins clinked, bowls were slurped and returned, chopsticks wiped on sleeves. Another stall waited 10 steps away. What mattered most was heat. Warm hands, warm broth, warm smoke cutting through cold, damp air. These markets weren't about luxury. They were survival made delicious. In a city of cramped homes and strict fire laws, street food was practical, safer, and often better than cooking inside. And once the first fire was lit, everyone knew the night had truly begun.
Dango vendors were easy to recognize. Their stalls were quieter, their fires smaller, their smells softer. Rows of round rice dumplings sat neatly skewered over gentle heat, brushed with sweet soy glaze or dusted with roasted soybean flour. The aroma was subtle but persistent, especially in the rain. Sweet, warm, faintly nutty. It drew people in without shouting. Dango was food for everyone. Children tugged sleeves for it, couples shared skewers. Older townspeople favored it because it was easy to chew and gentle on the stomach. Unlike noodles or eel, dango didn't demand urgency. You could stand a little longer, chew slowly, and let the warmth spread before returning to the crowd. Other sweets followed the same logic. Steamed buns filled with red bean paste, simple rice cakes, sugar-coated treats sold in small, hand-sized portions. These were not elaborate confections. Sugar was expensive, and excess was frowned upon. But a little sweetness mattered in a city where daily life was often harsh and repetitive. Sweets carried social meaning. Offering a dumpling was a small kindness, a way to soften a long walk or a cold night. Travelers ate them while waiting for ferries. Workers treated them as quiet rewards after late shifts. Even samurai, once again ignoring appearances, accepted skewers with a nod before slipping back into the dark. Unlike other street foods, sweets didn't stain the hands with grease or fill the air with smoke. They felt cleaner, calmer, almost domestic. Eating them outdoors blurred the line between home and street, turning a public road into a brief resting place. In a city built on discipline and routine, that gentleness mattered. If soba was the backbone of Edo's night food and sweets its comfort, fish cakes were pure efficiency. These were foods designed to be eaten quickly, cleanly, and without stopping, perfect for a city that never truly paused. Kamaboko and other fish snacks appeared everywhere at night, especially near bridges, waterways, and ferry landings. White fish was pounded into paste, shaped by hand, and cooked into firm cakes, some steamed, some grilled, some lightly fried. The smell was subtle but inviting, less aggressive than eel, less soothing than sweets. Fish cakes sat neatly in between. Salty, slightly sweet, and dense enough to quiet hunger. One bite, then another, and the skewer was gone. No bowls to return, no chopsticks to wipe, just food eaten standing and forgotten. As the night deepened, fried foods joined the mix. Small battered fish, tofu, and vegetables dropped into hot oil and handed over still crackling. These stalls drew clusters of people. The sound of frying acted like a signal flare. Rain and cold stopped mattering once the oil started hissing. Messengers, guards, boatmen, and night workers favored these stalls. They could eat while moving. Samurai on patrol stopped briefly, ate in silence, and moved on. Travelers trusted fish cakes because they were thoroughly cooked and unlikely to cause trouble, important in a city where inns were full and streets unfamiliar. Unlike roaming soba vendors, fish cake sellers stayed put. Their stalls became landmarks. Near the fish cake man by the bridge worked as well as any street name. Food mapped the city as much as buildings did. There was no glamour here. Fish cakes were practical, reliable, and unpretentious. They didn't promise comfort or luxury, just enough fuel to keep going. And in Edo, that was often enough. Edo's night food wasn't just about what you ate, it was about how you ate it. There were no tables, no stools, and no privacy. The street itself was the dining room. Eating meant standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, rain dripping from eaves, steam rising between faces that would never meet again. This shaped behavior. You learned to balance bowls, angle your body, slurp quickly, chew efficiently, and step aside when finished. Lingering wasn't rude by etiquette, it was rude because space was precious. Night markets softened social boundaries that daytime Edo kept rigid. Rank still existed, but it blurred when everyone was equally wet, hungry, and impatient. A laborer and a samurai might stand beneath the same awning, eating identical noodles from identical bowls. No conversation followed. None was required. There was an unspoken code. Don't stare, don't comment, don't complain about the rain or smoke. Everyone accepted the conditions. Street food demanded tolerance. In return, it offered warmth and speed. Vendors watched hands and posture more than faces. A nod meant ready, a glance meant almost finished. One person stepped back, another stepped forward. The exchange was brief, practiced, and refined by repetition. The food reflected this rhythm. Portions were modest, flavors bold, textures forgiving. Nothing required cutting or care. Everything assumed movement. The street dictated the menu. For travelers, it could feel chaotic. For locals, it was comfortingly familiar. The mess was manageable. The rules were unwritten but universal. Night food turned public space intimate without becoming personal. By morning, the street would forget you were ever there, except for the faint memory of smoke clinging to the wood. Edo's night markets belonged to no single class. They belonged to whoever was awake, hungry, and moving. In a society obsessed with rank and appearance, street food flattened distinctions without ever announcing that it was doing so. Commoners made up most of the crowd. Laborers finishing long shifts, artisans closing shops, porters heading home with aching shoulders. For them, street food wasn't indulgence, it was dinner. Travelers depended on it just as much. Edo was always full. Pilgrims, merchants, officials, messengers. Inns filled quickly, meals weren't guaranteed. A glowing lantern and a steaming pot were reassurance enough. And then there were the samurai. Officially restrained, unofficially human, many lived on fixed stipends that stretched thin in an expensive city. Street food was affordable, convenient, and discreet if eaten in the right corner of the night. A samurai beneath an awning with a bowl of soba was a quiet contradiction. Sword at the side, posture formal, chewing quickly, saying nothing. No one pointed it out. No one needed to. Everyone understood the arrangement. Appearances mattered, but hunger mattered more. Women were everywhere, too, despite the risks of night travel. Shopkeepers, vendors, travelers, and workers moved in groups or stuck to well-lit routes. Street food stalls offered more than nourishment. Light, noise, and people created pockets where you could pause without fear. Children appeared occasionally, sent on errands or trailing behind adults, clutching dumplings and trying not to drop them. Their presence made something clear. This wasn't a shadowy underworld, it was daily life continuing after sunset. Edo's night markets were democratic in the most practical sense. You didn't need permission, invitations, or connections. You needed coins and an appetite. For a few minutes at a stall, titles faded, and the only thing that mattered was whether the food was hot. In a city built on rigid order, that small freedom was quietly radical. Edo was obsessed with fire, and terrified of it. Most buildings were wooden, streets were narrow. One spark could erase entire neighborhoods. Laws governing cooking, lighting, and open flames were strict, especially at night. And yet, every evening, hundreds of charcoal fires flickered across the city. The night markets survived by mastering the art of not being troublesome. Vendors learned to work within the rules rather than challenge them. Fires were kept small and controlled. Charcoal was favored over open flame because it burned predictably and smoked less. Stalls clustered near water, bridges, and wide crossings where officials were less nervous and escape was easier if trouble appeared. Everything was designed for speed, including disappearance. Rain was both enemy and ally. It soaked clothes and turned streets to mud, but it also reduced fire risk. On wet nights, vendors appeared in greater numbers, knowing inspectors were less aggressive and customers more desperate for something hot. Lanterns glowed brighter in the rain, reflected in puddles like scattered stars. Officials did patrol, but enforcement was uneven. As long as traffic wasn't blocked, fights avoided, and fires contained, vendors were often tolerated. Officials ate too. Many knew exactly which stall to visit once their rounds ended. Menus adapted to bureaucracy. Foods that cooked quickly and cleanly survived. Anything requiring large flames, long preparation, or lingering smoke disappeared. This wasn't tradition shaping cuisine, it was regulation. Stalls were minimalist by necessity. No excess wood, no heavy structures. Everything could be packed up in moments. A shout, a glance, fires covered, pots sealed, lanterns lowered. The street returned to darkness as if nothing had happened. Rain sharpened the experience. Steam rose thicker, smells carried farther. Warm food felt urgent. People huddled closer, forming temporary communities beneath shared eaves and umbrellas. The night markets thrived not because they defied the city's rules, but because they bent around them. Edo was rigid by day and flexible by night. In that narrow space between law and necessity, street food endured, glowing softly, steaming patiently, always ready to vanish. As the night wore on, energy thinned, crowds grew quieter, footsteps spaced out, vendor calls stretched farther between echoes. One by one, charcoal fires dimmed, pots emptied, lanterns lowered. There was no closing bell. The markets ended the way they began, gradually, almost politely. Vendors packed with practiced efficiency, bowls wiped clean, skewers counted, coins tucked away, shoulder poles lifted again, lighter now without their steaming cargo. Carts rolled toward storage sheds or narrow homes where families waited. By dawn, only faint scorch marks and damp charcoal smells hinted at what had been there. For the city, this disappearance was essential. Streets had to return to their daytime roles, orderly, passable, unmarked. Edo tolerated night food because it left no scars. It fed the city without claiming it. For those who ate, the meals lingered longer than the stalls.
a bowl of soba under a bridge, eel eaten in the rain, a dumpling shared while waiting for a ferry. These moments stitched themselves into memory. Ordinary, repeatable, deeply personal. Everyone had a favorite corner, a trusted vendor, a preferred hour. The night markets quietly shaped Edo's relationship with food. They normalized eating outside the home. They valued warmth over refinement, function over display. Even as restaurants grew formal and cuisine elaborate, the logic of street food remained underneath it all. Most importantly, the night markets belonged to no one and everyone. They weren't institutions or written traditions. They existed because people were hungry, space was limited, and fire was both feared and necessary. As long as those conditions remained, so did the markets. By morning, Edo looked unchanged, busy, disciplined, restrained. But beneath the surface lingered the memory of steam, smoke, and shared hunger. And when night fell again, lanterns would rise, fires would glow, and the city would once more eat standing in the rain. A house in Roman Londinium did not greet you with peace and quiet. The moment you crossed the threshold, the city followed you inside. Sound slipped through thin walls. Smoke clung to the ceiling. Somewhere nearby, someone shouted, hammered, or argued over money. This was not a countryside villa with colonnades and fountains. This was Rome compressed, damp, and stubbornly alive in rainy Britain. Houses were narrow and practical, shaped by limited space rather than comfort. Streets were crowded, land was valuable, buildings pressed close together. Many homes were long rectangles opening directly onto the street. The front room often doubled as a shop or workspace, meaning privacy vanished the moment the door opened. Your home was part of the city's machinery. Light was scarce. Windows were small, shuttered against cold air and thieves. Rooms relied on oil lamps whose yellow glow barely pushed back the gloom. The oil came from far away. Even light was an imported luxury. Soot blackened ceilings, walls absorbed smoke, lungs noticed. Floors told a different story. Even modest homes insisted on Roman order. Mosaic or tiled floors marked living space, separating civilization from British mud. Shoes came off when possible. Dirt was swept daily. This was Britain, but it would behave like Rome whether it liked it or not. Furniture was minimal. Stools, low tables, storage chests against walls. Space mattered more than comfort. Rooms changed purpose throughout the day, sleeping at night, working by day, eating whenever food appeared. Privacy was something you learned to live with. Smell was unavoidable. Cooking fires burned indoors. Lamps smoked. Nearby drains ignored property lines. Add wet wool, damp wood, and too many bodies in too little space, and a Londinium house announced itself before you saw it. And yet, to its occupants, this was unmistakably Roman. The layout followed familiar rules, the decor copied Mediterranean styles. Daily routines, lighting lamps, sweeping floors, sharing space, reinforced identity. Outside, rain fell and barbarians waited. Inside, Rome endured. If light was scarce, color was not. Painted walls transformed cramped interiors into something deliberate and Roman. Plaster covered wood and brick. Reds, yellows, whites, and deep earth tones formed panels that mimicked stone blocks or marble slabs. These were illusion by design. Real marble was rare in Britain. Paint could pretend. A narrow room could feel grand if its walls suggested columns and polished stone. These were statements. A decorated wall announced status, money, or at least aspiration. Even modest households invested where visitors would see. Back rooms stayed plain. Front rooms performed. The British climate was unforgiving. Moisture crept into plaster. Cracks formed. Paint flaked. But the effort mattered. The empire lived here, even at the edge of the world.
Colors faded faster in rainy Britain than they would in the dry Mediterranean. Repairs were constant, touch-ups frequent. Owning a painted home in Londinium meant accepting that beauty required maintenance and patience. Motifs varied. Some walls bore simple geometric patterns. Others depicted vines, birds, or mythological figures copied from imperial pattern books. These images connected Londinium to Rome, Pompeii, and countless other cities. Standing in a rainy provincial house, you could see the same gods and designs found in wealthier, sunlit towns. Painted walls also served a practical role. They sealed plaster, reducing dust and making surfaces easier to clean. In smoky homes, this mattered. Soot wiped off painted surfaces more easily than raw plaster. Beauty and hygiene worked together quietly. At night, oil lamps brought these colors to life. Shadows flickered across panels, making flat designs seem to move. Rooms felt warmer, richer, more alive than daylight ever allowed. The illusion worked best after sunset. The walls didn't hide Londinium's hardships, but softened them. They reminded residents they were part of something vast and sophisticated. Outside, Britain was wet and cold. Inside, the walls said Rome had arrived and intended to stay. If walls declared Roman identity to the eye, floors did so to the feet. Stepping inside, the change was immediate. Mud, puddles, and churned earth gave way to order underfoot. Mosaic floors were not everywhere, but common enough to matter. Wealthy homes featured intricate designs of thousands of stones, arranged into patterns, borders, and images. Modest houses used simpler tiles, still clean, flat, deliberate. The message was clear. This space was Roman. Dirt was unwelcome. Mosaics served practical purposes as much as decorative ones. Durable, moisture-resistant, easy to sweep, they endured decades of boots, spilled food, and ash. Wooden floors rotted, stone endured. Designs varied. Geometric patterns, animals, plants, mythological scenes, chosen to reflect taste, education, and aspiration. A homeowner might never visit Italy, yet walk daily across Mediterranean dolphins and gods known only through stories. Bare feet in summer felt cool against stone. Sandaled steps echoed softly. Even in crowded homes, floors created a sense of order beneath daily chaos. Borders guided movement, marking cooking areas, sleeping zones, reception spaces. In homes with few walls, floors organized behavior. You didn't need signs. Your feet knew where to go. Maintenance was constant. Cracked tiles were replaced, loose stones reset. Neglect showed quickly. A damaged floor reflected poorly on the household. A well-kept mosaic signaled discipline as much as wealth. At night, oil lamplight caught pale stones and dark lines, making patterns shimmer. Even in smoky air, floors anchored the room. Above it, voices rose, fires burned, rain drummed. Beneath, Roman order remained solid, patient, unmoved by Britain's weather. Civilization began underfoot. Smoke, however, always won. Cooking fires, oil lamps, and braziers burned day and night. Chimneys were rare, ventilation poor, and open flames part of daily life. Living indoors meant breathing smoke. Cooking usually happened in small hearths or braziers, sometimes in the same room where people slept and worked. Meals were prepared over charcoal or wood, both producing thick fumes. Windows helped only when open, but Britain's cold and rain made that uncomfortable. Smoke rose slowly, settled along ceilings, staining plaster and darkening beams. Olive oil lamps added to the haze. They provided essential light, but burned constantly, especially in winter. Wicks needed trimming. Spilled oil left permanent stains. Surfaces absorbed traces of combustion. The smell lingered, on clothing, in hair, everywhere. Residents stopped noticing. Smoke became background, unpleasant but unavoidable. Fire was friend and threat. It cooked food, provided warmth, made indoor life possible, but it terrified the city. Entire blocks could vanish in hours. Fire regulations existed, and households managed flames carefully. Braziers were small, fires watched constantly. Nighttime caution became habit. Fires were extinguished before sleep whenever possible. Coals banked, water kept nearby. The sound of a neighbor's alarm could send everyone scrambling. Despite the risk, warmth mattered. Britain was colder than Rome. Without fire, rooms became damp and miserable. Smoke was the price of survival. Children grew accustomed, eyes adjusted, lungs adapted. Coughing was common but rarely questioned. Comfort was measured not by air quality, but by whether the fire stayed lit and rooms stayed warm. In a Roman Londinium house, smoke was the invisible occupant, always present, rarely acknowledged, absolutely essential. When daylight faded, the house did not grow quiet. Darkness pressed inward, shrinking rooms and corners, until only pools of lamplight remained. Oil lamps were the heart of indoor life. Without them, the household stopped functioning. Lamps were small, made of clay or bronze, shallow bowls holding olive oil with a wick protruding from a narrow spout. Once lit, the flames were steady but weak. One lamp illuminated only a small area, so most rooms relied on several, placed carefully to stretch light as far as possible. Olive oil was expensive, imported over long distances, and used deliberately. Lamps were lit where people gathered, not in empty corners. Hallways remained shadowy. Even light shaped behavior. People clustered near flames not for intimacy but practicality. Tasks requiring precision happened close to the lamp. Conversations occurred in tight circles. Children played near adults. Stories filled dark spaces the light could not reach. Maintenance was constant. Wicks burned unevenly. Too long, smoke choked the room. Too short, the flame flickered out. Oil had to be topped carefully. A knocked-over lamp was dangerous. Fire and oil together could destroy a household in minutes. But light mattered as much as warmth. Oil lamps produced a soft yellow glow that softened interiors. Painted walls looked richer. Mosaics shimmered faintly. Shadows danced across ceilings, giving still rooms a sense of movement. Even in smoky air, Roman order held, patient, deliberate, and quietly alive beneath Britain's cold and rain.
After dark, the illusion of comfort improved, even as smoke thickened the air. Night routines adapted around light. Work slowed. Meals happened earlier. Sleep came sooner in winter when oil ran low. Households rose and rested by flame as much as sun. Light in Londinium was controlled, rationed, respected. When lamps were finally extinguished, darkness didn't make the house empty, it felt paused, waiting for morning and gray British daylight to take over. No private bathrooms existed. Roman hygiene was communal, practical, and unapologetically public. Most houses relied on shared latrines down the street, beneath apartment blocks, or near public buildings. Stone or wooden benches with carved openings sat above flowing water or drainage channels. No partitions existed. Privacy wasn't expected. In larger houses, waste might drain into a cesspit or sewer. Convenient, but far from pleasant. Smells traveled. Blockages were common. Maintenance was constant. Neglect affected everyone. Water helped flush waste, but Londinium systems lagged behind Mediterranean cities. Heavy rain overwhelmed drains. Dry spells slowed flow. Cleaning indoors meant basins, cloths, cold water. Waste was removed, not hidden. Hygiene focused on management rather than elimination. Toilet paper did not exist. Shared sponges on sticks were rinsed between uses, a standard Roman practice, accepted without comment. Discomfort came from cold stone seats and damp air. Latrines were noisy, drafty, and fragrant. Houses near them paid the price, but convenience mattered more than comfort. Noise was constant. Walls were thin. Floors carried sound. Houses pressed tightly together. Living indoors meant living with everyone else's life. From the street came rattling carts, shouting vendors, splashing boots, and endless conversation. Workshops attached to houses added hammering, sawing, and grinding. Even after dark, Londinium did not sleep. Inside, voices carried through doorways, stairwells, footsteps echoed, pots clattered. Privacy of sound didn't exist. Families learned to speak over one another, ignore what could not be changed, and sleep through disturbances that would drive modern ears mad. Night amplified everything. Lamps lit, streets quieter. Even small sounds traveled far. A neighbor coughing, a door opening, a fire being tended, all became part of the shared soundscape. Silence often meant danger. Noise meant life continued around you. In Londinium, the house was not a retreat, it was the city folded inward. Noise passed freely, reminding everyone that Roman life in Britain was crowded, communal, and unavoidable, but rarely lonely. Night rearranged space. Beds were not fixed. Bedrooms, as we know them, barely existed. Sleep happened wherever space allowed. Most people used simple wooden frames or low platforms topped with straw or wool pads. Blankets were heavy, practical, often shared. Warmth mattered more than comfort. Rooms changed function. Work or eating areas became sleeping areas. Furniture was pushed aside. Lamps moved. Families negotiated sleeping spots by age, status, necessity. Children slept together, adults took the warmest spots near dying fires. Privacy was minimal. Couples shared space with children, servants, or lodgers. Sleep was light, fragmented, interrupted by coughing, snoring, footsteps, rain on the roof. Animals sometimes shared indoor space, dogs for companionship or pest control, cats hunting rodents. Their presence was accepted. Fires were treated cautiously at night. Coals glowed faintly, flames reduced, but rarely extinguished if warmth was needed. Risk haunted every household. Many learned to wake at the slightest unfamiliar sound or smell. Dreams mixed with reality in smoky air. Oil lamps cast moving shapes on walls until snuffed out. Darkness returned gradually, never fully. Moonlight and street lamps leaked faint glows inside. Morning arrived slowly through clouds. Houses shifted again. Bedding rolled, mats stacked, space reclaimed for work and movement. Sleep was not escape. It was another shared activity shaped by crowding, climate, and caution. The Roman night was darker, closer, briefly still. By morning, a Londinium house looked ordinary, damp floors, smoky air, muted gray light. Yet every detail, from painted walls to worn mosaic underfoot, carried a message. This was Rome, even here, under clouds. Living in such a house required constant compromise. Roman ideals of order, beauty, and comfort collided with cold weather, cramped streets, and limited resources. Olive oil was precious, light rationed, space shared, privacy rare. Yet people built, decorated, and organized homes according to Roman customs. Persistence mattered. A Londinium house was not just shelter, it was identity. Living like a Roman meant participating in the empire regardless of geography. Cooking with Roman tools, sleeping in Roman layouts, walking on Roman floors reinforced belonging in ways laws and coins could not. The house also bridged cultures. Local Britain adopted Roman styles, Roman settlers adapted to British conditions. The result was sturdier, not perfect Italy. Walls were thicker, fires burned longer, routines shifted earlier to match the climate. Rome bent without breaking.
Archaeology reveals the quiet resilience of daily life. Broken lamps, chipped mosaics, soot-stained plaster. These fragments tell stories of ordinary existence rather than monuments. Londinium houses offered little protection from rain, noise, or smoke. What they did offer was familiarity. In a distant province, familiarity was power. It made foreign land navigable, survivable, and eventually home. Residents stepped outside into muddy streets carrying their Roman identity and returned at night to recreate it within wooden walls. Roman Londinium was defined not just by forums or roads, but by thousands of small, smoky houses where people lived, adapted, and insisted that Rome belonged here too. Boudica was born into a society where childhood was immediate, practical, and unshielded. Among the Iceni of eastern Britain, life began outdoors, with cattle, fields, and people measuring wealth in animals. Children were immersed directly into adult life. The Iceni lived in scattered round houses, built of wood, wattle, and thatch, interiors smoky and shared. Voices overlapped, animals were close, fires always burned. Privacy was rare, belonging was constant. Herds defined power, security, and marriage prospects. From early childhood, Boudica learned to recognize and care for animals, respect fences and boundaries, and understand wealth as living, vulnerable, and immediate. Oral history was central. Elders recited lineages, victories, wrongs, and ancestral lands, not as entertainment, but as instruction. Women were not hidden from this knowledge. Girls learned the same tribal pride and responsibilities as boys. Leadership could take female hands. Memory carried it forward. Roman influence crept at the edges. Traders passed through, rumors spread. Shiny goods, foreign coins, and new laws appeared. Adults spoke carefully, watched the roads. Boudica felt the pressure of a changing world without needing to understand politics. Stories grew sharper, defensive. Identity mattered more when threatened. Education was embedded in life. Boudica learned by watching, copying, and doing. Children followed adults into fields and pastures, absorbing routines through repetition. Walking among cattle, tending fires, gathering wood, preparing food, wielding tools. These lessons were practical, gender-neutral, essential for survival. Cold, rain, mud, and mistakes taught endurance, awareness, and respect for the land. Hunting and basic weapon use began early. Every child learned the tools of defense. Observation, imitation, and play edged into serious skill. Mothers guided learning, teaching survival and social strength. Roman goods and tools sparked curiosity. Adults discussed trade and shifting power. By adolescence, Boudica's education was essentially complete. She knew her land, her people, and her responsibilities. Learning continued in evenings by the fire, where oral history trained memory and reinforced identity. Elders carried the past with ritual precision. Ancestors, migrations, alliances, betrayals, names and places mattered. Forgetting meant losing land or honor. Geography was memory. Stories defined enemies, taught judgment alongside strength, praised pride but warned against recklessness. Women featured prominently. Boudica grew up understanding that leadership and courage were not limited by sex. Rituals, seasonal gatherings, and feasts repeated the same lessons. Participation mattered more than performance. Roman pressure intensified the stakes. As taxes, laws, and military presence expanded, elders emphasized oral traditions. Identity had to be defended verbally before it could be defended physically.
Boudica absorbed her world not through instruction, but through immersion. The past lived in voices, gestures, and ritual. By maturity, stories were no longer lessons. They were part of her thinking, embedded so deeply that later action required no search for motivation. Among the Iceni, womanhood was defined by visibility, strength, and responsibility. She grew up watching women work, argue, negotiate, and endure. Obedience alone was insufficient. Survival required resolve. Mothers managed households, protected family interests, and guided daily life. Physical strength was trained by necessity, not ideology, and capable women were respected and central to ritual and counsel. Leadership was situational, earned through action, and reinforced through stories of women who led migrations, defended settlements, or guided decisions during crises. Roman influence introduced contrasts. Roman women were often confined, their power quiet and indirect. To Iceni girls, what outsiders called improper or unfeminine was practical and honorable. Boudica learned that strength could be visible, voice could be raised, and authority claimed when circumstances demanded it. Submission was not the default. Leadership was imaginable because she had watched it lived daily. Wealth among the Iceni was living and tangible. Cattle defined prosperity, stability, and influence. Children learned early which animals belonged to which families and why, observing negotiations, boundary disputes, and alliances. Losing cattle meant vulnerability. Protecting them built loyalty. Leadership meant stewardship, not domination. Roman coins were alien, abstract, and less trustworthy than herds. Adults debated trade, tribute, and obligation, while children listened. Iceni women could own property and exercise authority, embedding in Boudica the lesson that power came from responsibility. As Roman pressure increased, cattle symbolized independence and resistance, intertwining practical management with identity. As Boudica moved toward adolescence, Rome became unavoidable. Roads, forts, and soldiers reshaped landscapes and routines. Adults spoke cautiously, decisions slowed, hospitality became measured. Roman goods carried expectations of obedience, tribute, and acceptance of foreign authority. Children absorbed these tensions, a soldier laughing near the market, elders scowling over taxes, parents warning against wandering too far. Rome did not need to strike, its presence alone altered behavior. Officially a client kingdom, the Iceni were allowed self-governance under Roman oversight, yet rules changed unpredictably. Authority could arrive uninvited, speak with confidence, and demand compliance. Resistance was as much about maintaining old ways as open defiance. Roman confusion over female authority only sharpened Iceni identity. Language, dress, ritual, and memory became markers of belonging. Boudica's generation inherited a culture under pressure, not ease. Adolescence blurred into adulthood without ceremony. Expectations rose. Strength, awareness, and self-control were no longer preparation, they were required. Observation was crucial. Boudica watched disputes, alliances, and Roman interventions closely. She learned whose word carried weight, who commanded respect, and how reputation was earned. Reliability, composure, and kin loyalty shaped a young woman's standing. Through these lessons, Boudica grew into a leader already versed in the responsibilities, pressures, and resilience her role demanded.
Loudness without purpose invited danger. Courage without judgment, failure. Boudica learned to balance presence with restraint, a skill that would define her leadership. Training continued informally, carrying loads, riding, enduring long hours outdoors. Iceni women did not relinquish strength with age. Adolescence refined it. Marriage entered conversation not as romance, but as politics. Lineage, character, and family resources mattered. Choices carried consequences beyond the household, complicated by Roman influence. Aligning wrongly could invite scrutiny. Aligning too closely with Rome risked tribal support. Physical presence mattered. Tall, confident, composed, Boudica stood out, but authority required repeated demonstration through judgment in action. Observing Roman officials reinforced lessons. Power was not always as solid as it appeared. By the end of adolescence, she was no longer merely absorbing her world, she evaluated it. Childhood gave identity. Adolescence gave clarity. Action would follow observation. Marriage arrived as both obligation and opportunity. Union with Prositagus, a man of status, strengthened alliances under Roman pressure. Boudica's personal authority grew. Iceni customs allowed women to retain influence within households and beyond. Her voice carried weight, backed by lineage, reputation, and alliance. Motherhood sharpened her understanding of power. Defending land, identity, and autonomy became immediate. Roman presence tightened. Client kingship offered fragile peace. Laws favored Roman officials and creditors. autonomy narrowed with each imposed agreement. Wealth coexisted with vulnerability. Security relied on Roman tolerance. Power was conditional, respect temporary. Childhood freedom yielded to responsibility. Every Roman demand tested patience. Every compromise chipped at identity. Boudica learned the fragility of power granted rather than earned. Cattle still grazed, stories were still told, but Rome no longer lingered at the edges. It stood over everything. Her upbringing had been rigorous, working the land, absorbing oral histories, watching women lead, understanding wealth as living and vulnerable. Rebellion was not taught, it was recognized. Lessons of endurance, responsibility, and the defense of communal wealth pointed toward inevitability. The mothers who modeled strength, the cattle symbolizing autonomy, the pressures of Rome all shaped her response. When the time came, her actions were neither sudden nor emotional. They were rooted, informed by a childhood spent understanding the operation of power, both fair and unjust. Before war cries, flames, and speeches, there was a girl among the Iceni, raised to know exactly what was being taken, and that upbringing made everything that followed possible, even inevitable.